Thanks very much, John. Ewan, if I can ask you, and then Kate. Thank you.
Excuse me, I'm just going to talk briefly about the general broadcasting environment and then about the situation in Scotland. It's important to remember that broadcasting, both Ian and Joan have mentioned the decline of the press, but broadcasting environment is changing quite dramatically, and the kind of debates that broadcasters have is very different to what it was even 10 years ago. There's a lively academic debate about whether we can even still talk about broadcasting because of the multi-channel era, whether it's not more accurate to talk about narrowcasting, where with all these channels you have small niche audiences as opposed to the huge mass audiences of the past. Can we also still talk about public service broadcasters when broadcasting companies now offer complementary online offerings to most things that they actually do? So it's important in the debate to look at the environment going forward as opposed to the environment of a few years ago. Having said that, some of these issues shouldn't be overstated in Scotland. Academics often talk about the decline of television now, whether rightly or wrongly. In Scotland, we are world-class television watchers. We watch on average 4.5 hours a day, which is larger than the rest of the United Kingdom. Also, the internet, although most people in this room are probably very internet savvy, and certainly people in the media are, we forget that large numbers of people in Scotland don't even have access to broadband. Only 68% of people in Scotland actually have broadband, only 60% in our largest city, and rather scandalously, among households earning less than £17,500, only a third of those households actually have broadband, and I think it's a big fear that there's a new form of social exclusion opening up there. For those reasons, perhaps television is more important in Scotland at the moment than other countries. I think if we're looking ahead to what we're hoping for, well, so I'm hoping for an independent Scotland, and the debate about whether we should have a Scottish broadcasting corporation is to look at what the purpose of a public service broadcaster actually is in this changing environment. The functions of public service broadcasters have changed, although some are constant. The main justification for having a public service broadcaster is the idea of the audience as citizens, not consumers. The commercial channels will cater for consumers, but will they necessarily cater for citizens? There have been other important themes originally, the kind of Reithian idea of a cultural impact of having a higher culture. That's diminished in some respects, and the BBC and other broadcasters have embraced more the idea of a public service broadcaster as a window on society that it's broadcasting to. The idea of representing diversity is very important for public service broadcasters to justify their position, somewhat paradoxically as well as reflecting diversity. Public service broadcasters are also there to bring the nation together. And you could see in the Olympics coverage the importance of the BBC in that in terms of bringing the UK together. Now, as someone who's a supporter of independence, we shouldn't gloss over the fact that small countries do have particular issues. That to make a television programme, there are fixed production costs, whether you are broadcasting to 100 million people or to 1 million people. And that does present certain challenges to small countries that we shouldn't gloss over. But if I can talk specifically about the situation in Scotland, our main public service broadcaster is the BBC, although interestingly, ITV, Channel 4 and even Channel 5 are defined by the UK government as public service broadcasters. But clearly the BBC is the main public service broadcaster. It has a number of public purposes which relate in some respects to these general purposes that I was talking about. One of them is the idea of sustaining citizenship, clearly related to the idea of seeing the audience as citizens, not consumers. The BBC is regulated by a trust. In their last report, they said there was a gap in terms of understanding politics in the nations and regions. This was the feedback they were getting. And I just think on a practical level, if people like me, that I have young children, I'm doing other things at 6:30 at night, I don't watch Reporting Scotland or the STV News. My next opportunity on BBC One to see Scottish news is a 7-minute bulletin at 10:30, which often will have 3 stories because, again, people have spoken about staff cutbacks. Sometimes packages will not even be recut. So they might just play out 2 or 3 stories from the early evening bulletin. Now, clearly, I just don't understand how the BBC on its main mixed genre channel, BBC One, can say it's sustaining Scottish citizenship when you're getting 7 minutes of news after 7 o'clock. So notwithstanding the fact that there are small country issues, at the moment, almost anything would be an improvement in that regard. This idea of diversity as well, the BBC has a public purpose of representing the UK, its nations, regions and communities. Again, the BBC Trust in its last report said this year the gap widened, particularly the portrayal of nations and regions. And I think Ian's mentioned the fact that the BBC has decentralised. Now that's true to a large extent in terms of production. But I think the fear is that Pacific Quay, this lovely new digital headquarters in Glasgow, to some extent is becoming a big production house. Now that's good in terms of jobs, although again there are issues about how many of these jobs are actually local. But the kind of basic function of BBC Scotland being a window on the society, on the community it serves, I think there's a real issue there. If you look at Ofcom figures, year-on-year spend, in the latest Ofcom market report, year-on-year spend by STV and BBC combined on first-run originated programming for viewers in Scotland was £53 million. That's across both of BBC and STV, our major broadcasters. Over 5 years, that spend has decreased by 24%. Now, it's important to say this is not some sort of anti-Scottish thing. This has happened across the UK. So spending on programmes for Wales, Northern Ireland and for the English regions has also fallen. So you've got these two processes at work, I would argue. One, programmes that would otherwise have been made in London, the M25, now being made outside, but still the same programmes. And programmes that are meant for what's called local audiences, the amount of money being spent on those is declining dramatically. So even notwithstanding the fact that Scotland was independent and you have these small country issues about fixed production cost, almost anything would be an improvement now, I would argue, in terms of reflecting Scotland on screen. And it's particularly acute at peak time, between 7 o'clock and 10 o'clock. On average, you're probably going to get per week on BBC One and BBC Two, maybe 2 hours a week. More days than not, you might not see anything specifically about Scotland. Now, that might not be an issue for some people, but in terms of being a window on the society that the BBC is broadcasting to, which should be one of its core functions, I think there are issues there. Finally, obviously, the cutbacks that are taking place are severe, and Joan's right, this shouldn't really be a party political issue, but they're having already a dramatic impact, I would argue, on news coverage, notwithstanding what the BBC Scotland management says. I think as we look forward, there are other examples we can look to across Europe. You could look at maybe, if you like, the Rolls-Royce of small country broadcasters, which would be Denmark. Denmark has its public service broadcaster, the DR, has DR1, DR2, a children's programme, a culture programme, a 24-hour news programme, an HD channel. It has a production fund, and it has something like 7 or 8 regional stations in a country the same size as Scotland. Now, of course, their licence fee is a lot more. You could look at a different model, which is Ireland, which wouldn't be appropriate for Scotland with its dual funding model. But it shows that there are examples out there outside of the United Kingdom that certainly, I think, we should be looking at as we're thinking about going forward, whether or not in an evolved or, as I would hope, in an independent context.
Thanks very much, Ewan. I noticed Katie didn't mention Borgen. Did you notice that when he talked about Denmark?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, you'll be pleased to know I'm not actually going to talk about Borgen this time, and I am going to preface my remarks by apologising, because I'm more or less probably going to say my piece and listen to a bit of Professor Devine's and cut and run, and I apologise for that. I managed to double book myself, but I have a hot ticket for a Sant Etienne gig and a Scritti Politti gig, and they don't gig very often if anybody knows about them, so I'm afraid I'm not missing it, not even for all of you. I have to say there's quite a lot of doom and gloom, and a lot of it is justified, but I want to take a slightly different approach and present a few challenges and try and present a slightly more glass half full approach. I think the first thing that it's good to remind ourselves is that there's more to broadcasting than the BBC, and that we already have an independent Scottish company in STV, and you know, it may have its faults and its weaknesses, but it's there and we own it and it's ours. And whether or not we vote yes, and I sincerely hope we do, in the independence referendum, we still have an independent commercial broadcaster. And also we have huge swathes of radio stations. We have BBC Radio Scotland, but we also have commercial radio output and also community radio. And I think we need to be careful not to just limit how we approach broadcasting by looking only at what the BBC contributes now and can contribute to our future as a nation. I think the other point, and the second point I would make, is that Scotland is not North Korea. We are not just limited to our terrestrial channels, and other commentators have made that point as well. You know, the media and broadcast media is not traditional any longer. There are social media, there's new media, and as Ewan pointed out, multimedia channels. And I think, again, we should start thinking about our broadcasting output, and certainly in the context within which we sit, which is as global citizens, where we can all access channels online. I was one of the people watching the US election results online through kind of independent US channels, and following live blogs at New York Times. At the same time, I had about 4 or 5 different threads going between laptop and iPad and TV and radio. And, you know, it was instrumental in basically receiving lots of different views and viewpoints on the presidential elections. And so, you know, whether or not we become independent, we are not living within simply the kind of the geographical confines of where we are in terms of how we in the future will access our media output. And I think as well, it's important to realise that, and this is perhaps more acute for somebody like me who works in the sector that I do, that it's not always about inputs in terms of equating with outputs and outcomes. And absolutely hear and agree entirely with what Joan was saying about how concerning it is about how limited income and really startling figures that Ewan presented to us there about the limit in production of a total spend of 52 million, given that, you know, even if we just took the 10% share of BBC licence fee into Scotland on day one of independence, it would amount to 325 million, which is not a small sum. So to the fact that there's only 52 million across both BBC in Scotland and STV at the moment being spent on production is alarming. But actually, you know, again, if you equate it even with Hollywood, it's not always those who spend the most on what they produce that create the biggest bang for their buck. And we have to not just look constantly at what we put in terms of what we get, and that then equates to a quality product, because there are different ways and different models of doing that. The next thing I want to say is probably a bit of a heresy, in that I was one of the people who was very upset at losing BBC Six Music off my digital channels when BBC Alba went on to Freeview. I have to say, I was most nonplussed, because I'm a non-Gaelic speaker, I'm a lowlander. And why, you know, I felt quite that this was an imposition on me, when actually I spend most of my evenings with BBC Music through my telly in the background to what I'm doing. But actually, what it meant me doing was I eventually got out there and finally bought myself a digital radio. So I now have BBC Six Music in the kitchen playing, which again, you know, is part of the fact that we are global citizens and we are not just restricted to being Scottish, but our tastes and our culture and our influences are shaped by a whole range of contributors. But actually, I love BBC Alba, and my 9-year-old son regularly appears with bizarre Gaelic phrases that he's picked up because he's been watching something that's been in the background. And actually, it's news and current affairs output in terms of taking a non-traditional Scottish view, and certainly doing that role that Joan spoke eloquently about Scottish window in the world, and the conversation we have ourselves is actually really important. So I've gone from being a naysayer to an avid watcher, and I think there's lessons in that for all of us. The other thing I want to say is two things really around the issue of political coverage, if you like. I think there's something in how we approach. There's just something I think about being careful about audiences. And I think there is an equation to be had, exactly the point that Ewan was making about citizens and not being consumers. I think there's a relationship and a correlation to be made by the very narrow confines in which politics is reported in this country, and disengagement and disenfranchisement, and the actual fact that so many of our audience of 5 million citizens in Scotland is actually crowded out of that debate. And a good example of that to some extent is the focus in the last week about the he says, she says over whether or not Scotland would be a member of the European Union, without actually exploring any of the issues about the desirability of Scotland being in the European Union as an independent country, what European Union membership can bring it. But it's been debated on a very narrow, linear approach, on a very polarised approach. And I think that turns off a lot of audiences, and I think it's both a correlation with and a symptom of where we sit in terms of political debate in the country. And I really would like to see a real wholesale shift in how we cover politics in Scotland, and that actually engages women, engages children and young people, engages black and ethnic minority communities, engages people at the lower end of the income scale in a much more creative way, and actually brings them into the debate. At the moment, we have a very narrow number of people who are allowed to debate on in our broadcast media the big political issues of the day, and they're either paid politicians or they are commentators, and yes, I am increasingly one of those now, but actually it's still a very narrow gene pool, and I don't think that does our political discourse any favours. And one of the things I think that sometimes, I think in terms of the debate that we're about to have and the conversation with ourselves, I remember a few years back that Channel 4 did a really interesting thing with citizens' juries, where it had panels of experts, if you like, and commentators debating a topical, thorny issue and quite controversial issue of the day, but it had people there in the audience, and they actually really got into the nitty-gritty, exactly the kind of thing you were talking about, Joan, where, you know, there's a very kind of surface view, taking a very narrow approach that sometimes doesn't even have a Scottish context to it, but really analyses, forensically analyses, and allows people, and at the end of those programmes, people actually took a vote on what they thought, and very often from the beginning of the programme to the end, because they've been given the opportunity to explore their views and the evidence on an issue, their views change completely from the beginning to the end of that. And I think that's the kind of national conversation we need to be having about the big issues about our constitutional future. And just one final point, I think, is just to say that, having talked quite a wee bit about politics, there's more to our broadcasting needs and interests than politics. And as an independent nation, this to me is exactly where our glass is half full in Scotland. You know, let's go all the way back. We invented television. We have given some of the best media voices and programmes in kind of broadcasting history. We have huge creative talents out there. We need to invest in those skills. We need to find ways of enabling them to use different platforms and not just traditional media. And we also need to build on our strengths. And one of Scotland's strengths is children's programming. We contribute more to the UK output in children's programming than any other nation in the UK. And there's something that we can be selling to the world and we can be rightly proud of. And there's something to build on if we become independent. And I'd like to just finish on saying that I actually think, yes, I think there are a lot of concerns. I think there are issues around how broadcasting and where it sits at the moment in terms of its income, but actually our glass is half full, but it's also filled with a bit of a tension. And one of the things I picked out of, I think that summarises well that tension, is that in 2011, one of BBC Scotland's huge success stories was the fact that it live streamed the World Pipe Band Championships to 82 countries. Live streamed an event happening in Scotland to 82 other countries. But there's the tension there about, does that reflect the modern Scotland that we think we are and that we want programme and content about, or does it reflect a Scotland that the rest of the world thinks still exists here? And I think that's a tension that, however we take forward broadcasting, we need to resolve, and it's actually quite a big part of our national conversation with ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Kate got slightly more than her allotted 5 minutes because she won't be able to stay for the duration.